Hello everyone, back at it again with my little yellow kayak, and I'm on a trail in the woods. There's a lot of these trails around me. Some are part of old railroad networks, and they convert them into rail trails, and then they connect these different rail trails to each other, and you get a series of trails through the woods. People use them for walking or walking a dog, or I don't know, maybe a baby in a stroller. See a lot of bicyclists. But the nice thing for me is that this particular trail goes right past a pond. And there used to be another access, but they shut that down. So this is currently the only access that I know of. And I've got a boat cart on the front of my kayak, and I'm just taking my kayak for a walk in the woods. It's about a mile to the pond. After a while, the kayak gets kind of heavy, but it's still better than carrying it a mile. The old access was a little shorter, and that one I did carry because it was so steep. But this trail is pretty flat. It's just the beginning that's steep. And I can get to another part of the pond where there's an easier launch. So every once in a while, my arm gets kind of tired and I switch arms and just keep going. There was another launch point earlier, but it looked pretty steep and the bottom looked pretty muddy. And then I'd have to go down this river for quite a ways, and there's no wind at all today, so I think the bugs would get me. But we got a nice fall day. It's mostly cloudy, and there's no wind at all, like I mentioned. And so this time of year when there's no wind, a good option for me is ultralight panfish. I could bring my bass gear and try to get them to bite when there's no wind, but instead of banging my head against the wall for a while, I figured I would fish the panfish gear and have a whole lot more action. Sometimes when it's dead calm like this, completely flat, you can cast a frog into the lily pads and the bass will just bolt. You know, before the lure even fully touches down, they're gone. And it's really hard to catch them when they're like that. So that's what I was hoping to avoid by bringing the ultralight panfish rods. I've fished this pond before, a couple times carrying it from that other access point, and a couple times in the winter. So these trails make a great place to drag a ice sled down too. The only thing you can't do on them is run motorized vehicles down them. So I think I'm okay with the kayak on wheels. And here's the launch spot I was talking about. Nice and flat, not too muddy. Yeah, so I've been here before and I know that the pond has fish in it. It's got bass, it's got small pickerel, and it has some decent sized panfish. So that's what I'm after today. And by far the most common panfish in here are bluegill. Now a few of them are quite good size, but they're playing hard to get today. I still got a few that were pretty nice. So another thing that people like to mess with besides minnow traps, that was an earlier video, is boat carts. So I always try to put it in the mud or in the bushes a little bit, just not right at the boat launch to make it completely obvious. Got to get my neck gaiter up. Even though it's pretty late in the year, it's warm today. It's in the 70s, which is unusual for New England in late October. And the bugs are out. So it's not too sunny. I don't really need the neck gaiter for the sun. I need it for the bugs. And there's a lot of them in this pond in the woods. So as I'm going out, I can see every once in a while there's a fish in the pads. It kind of darts out. There's one right there. But further out there are panfish. I later find out they're almost all bluegill. But they're sucking bugs off the surface of the water. And I don't know exactly what they were feeding on. It was probably a mix of different things. I know there's still some mosquitoes around. It's been a really wet summer here, and I think the mosquitoes have done pretty well. But the bluegill aren't too particular about what kind of bugs they eat off the surface. So to start out, I'm going to be throwing a Z-Man shad fries in the purple death color. It kind of looks like a baby bluegill. At least that's what I think I'm imitating when I fish it. And the bigger sunfish will eat it no problem. But the issue today is that I've got no wind and the fish aren't super fired up. I can see them all around the pond rising to bugs. And I might have better luck with a fly rod or something like that. Or even a popper. But I didn't bring those things. So I'm trying the more aggressive stuff first. And if I have some success, I'll stick with that. And if not, I'm going to hang up that lure and try a different rod or a different bait. And I should pretty quickly get into some fish. I can see them all around me. So if they're not eating what I'm throwing, I'm going to throw something else. It's sort of like, if you're at a restaurant and the waitress asks you if you would like chicken for dinner. You say no. And then the waitress asks you, do you want chicken? Do you want chicken? That's what you're doing when you're throwing the same thing after the fish refuse whatever bait you're throwing. They already told you they don't want it, so try to offer them something else. So that's what I'm doing. I'm fishing a Z-Man larvas here in green pumpkin. It's a very natural bait. Kind of a buggy looking thing. Maybe it looks like a baby dragonfly nymph. And they would bump it. They'd grab the tail. And eventually one of them ripped the tail off of the bait. And if they're really active, they should eat that whole thing no problem. At least the bigger ones should eat it no problem. And they just weren't that active. So this is plan B. It's a little bit more subtle than the shad fries. I'm working it slower. I work it with short hops and pauses. And I still wasn't getting the response that I wanted. Sometimes panfish can be really easy to catch. Other times you need to finesse them a little bit more. And in conditions like this, I had to go with plan C, which is a bobber or float and a tiny ice jig. I'm still flailing around with that larvas, but the ice jig under a float is super finessey because it's just suspended right there in their face. And the other thing that I did was I tipped the lure I was using with a piece of worm. Alright, now I've gone to plan C. I'm getting a piece of worm out, and you only need a little tiny piece, about an inch. And I add it directly over the bait I have on that ice jig, which is a Lunker Hunt spade tail grub. You could use a lot of different things. I really just want it there for bulk and color, because the water is very stained here. I wanted just a little bit bigger profile, and then the extra scent from the piece of worm And I think this was my first cast and I'm hooked up. It's not a big fish, but it just kind of tells me I'm on the right path with the float and the jig. Yeah, he's not bad. And if they wouldn't eat the float and the jig, you can take the lure off, that Lunker Hunt Spade-tailed grub, and just put the worm on the jig. And if they don't eat that, geez, it might be time to go home, try again another day, or I could mess with the length of the bobber and the position of the hook to either go shallower or deeper. But in general, once I get to plan C, if they don't eat that, there's some sort of problem. Either I'm in the wrong spot, or the pond doesn't have fish, or the fish are too small to eat that little jig. So what I'm doing with this float and jig is I'm waiting for the fish to dimple on the surface. And they're doing that to chase bugs around. And then I'm chasing them that are chasing the bugs. So it's a visual way of fishing. You have the fish dimpling the surface, chasing bugs. You got a float on the surface, which is another visual aid. So it's kind of fun for me to chase these panfish around the pond. I got a beautiful fall day, nice warm temperatures. And it's not going to be like this for very much longer. It's going to get cold, cold, cold. So I'm enjoying just floating around here and loading the boat with fish. That's also how I like to fish for trout most of the time. Is I like fishing trout in the evening or early morning when they're dimpling flies on the surface of the water and then casting directly to those dimples. Actually, it's a little better if you lead them, if you can see what direction the trout are going in and you lead them. That's a fun way to fish too, especially when it gets a little colder. But for now, we're fishing bluegill. And yeah, I just wait for that float to either bounce or go under. Sometimes they're actually doing a lift bite, and you can see that on the float. When the float goes flat on the water, that means the fish have lifted the jig up, and the float no longer has tension on it, and it'll lay over on its side. There's a couple fish that did that, and you wouldn't really feel them if you didn't have the visual aid of the float. So you really need the float to see that you've got a bite. So once I figured out that this was the presentation they liked best, the rest was pretty straightforward. You just cast to wherever the fish were dimpling on the surface. I know it's hard to see on the camera, but they were really everywhere. And so as soon as I get a fish and let him go, I'm always looking around for a next spot to cast to. And if I made a good cast, it was almost automatic where I'd get another fish. And so it was a pretty dramatic difference from fishing the Z-Man micro baits, which are great baits earlier. They just weren't into it because I don't have any wind. He's all right. It's greasy calm now. I think at one point there was a little puff of wind and it lasted about a minute and then back to flat calm. But the surface of the pond's like a mirror. You can see the reflection of the trees. Thought I might pick up some other fish, but it was all sunfish today. And it seemed like the bigger fish were offshores a ways. When I got closer to the shoreline, fished the outer edges of pads and things like that, I tended to catch smaller fish. And you can use that information for ice fishing later in the year. They tend to, in the late fall, they tend to hang out where they're going to spend most of the winter. And so I'm trying to kind of triangulate where is going to be a good spot to start ice fishing when we do get ice. I think I landed right on that fish's head right there because float went down right away. The other thing that was happening, and I really didn't expect this, was some of the fish were going after the float, which is unusual for this time of year. I think it's just because it was so warm. But I bet I could have caught a couple, like I said earlier, on a fly or on a little tiny popper. I just didn't think to bring those things because it's when this was filmed, it was almost Halloween. And normally they don't act like that this late in the season. So what I did instead was I shortened up the leader length between the bobber and the ice jig. Because if they're on the surface chasing bugs, they're active enough to go after the float, then I didn't have to fish as deep. So I shortened up that leader length to the ice jig, and it seemed like it worked out okay. Sometimes I do the opposite. If I'm catching a bunch of little fish and I think they're just beating the bigger fish to the jig, I'll lengthen that leader. Try to get to the fish underneath the smaller fish. But today it seemed like they liked the shorter leader best. That's a Thill Mini Shy Bite float. I don't know if they still make it anymore, but it's a really great float. It's super sensitive, and the fish don't feel any resistance. A lot of times they'll spit a hook if they feel the resistance from a float. And with that float, it's so small, it's so thin, the fish don't feel any resistance at all, and you can usually stick them. So if you could find some of those mini Thill Shy Bite floats, I would recommend picking some up. And if you can't, what you want is a small, thin float, just big enough to float a 1/32 ounce jig head. So the jig head is a 1/32 ounce tungsten ice jig. It's a VMC Mongo jig head. The Mongo part is it has a little bit bigger hook. It's still a very small hook though, and it can accommodate plastic bait and a little piece of worm, and it's good for bigger fish. It doesn't bend out as easily because it's a size larger than a standard ice jig hook, and it doesn't seem to impede the fish from getting hooked up at all. I'm catching them one after another. Anyway, I really like that jig, but you could fish other ice jigs just as well. One thing about the bluegill is that they seem to really prefer a horizontal presentation, and so after every single fish I have to straighten out the knot on my ice jig so that when it's in the water it will present the bait horizontally. Yeah, he's not bad. And if the fish pull the tail on the worm or on that little piece of plastic, and so that the jig is sitting vertically or at a 45-degree angle, or if you tried to tie a loop knot and the bait just sat at a 45-degree angle, they do not hit it as nearly as well. Sometimes not at all. You think, what the heck is wrong with my bait? There's nothing wrong with the bait, it's just that the knot position moved on the ice jig. And that seems to be a really key thing for bluegill. I guess the baits just don't look very natural to them unless they're hanging perfectly horizontally in the water. For whatever reason, it seems to be a big deal to the bluegill, less so for other fish. So like with perch, I can still catch them even if the bait isn't perfect. I still try to position the knot, you know, so the bait hangs properly. I'd say crappie are kind of in between. Sometimes they can be kind of particular about baits hanging horizontally. Other times they don't seem to care as much. See that big splash over there? That was a beaver. And the beaver's telling me he doesn't want me in his pond anymore. So, yeah, I made a few more casts, and that was my, my cue to leave, I think, from the beaver. There's a lodge down the river a ways, and there's another lodge on the other side of the pond. And, yeah, I guess I was too close to something or other. So I made a few casts, and then I decided that was it. I don't want to deal with the beaver tail slapping while I'm fishing. Plus it was getting towards 5 o'clock, and I figured I got a long ways to drag the kayak down the trail. And I was getting a little hungry too, to be honest. So it was just time to go. Nice and easy launch. And I'm back walking the kayak down the trail. So I'm sure there's probably a trail or two near you wherever you live. And a lot of times these trails go past waterways that don't have any other access. And yeah, they can be great spots for fishing depending on what fish are in these ponds. They really don't get a lot of pressure. I mean, not many people are going to drag a kayak a mile through the woods on wheels. They just won't do it. And so you can have these places all to yourself, and the fish tend to be not too smart. On a different day, I could bring my bass gear and have the whole pond to myself and have a great time. The one thing that you want to consider, though, is at certain times of the year, these trails get really busy with people. And I don't want to give anybody a reason to complain about some guy walking a kayak down the trail. So I always try to be really polite to people. If there's somebody on the trail, I pull over. I don't want any kind of issues. If I see fishing trash, I pick it up. Because I don't want to lose this access. I already lost another access. Yeah, so if this was a really busy time of the year, I just wouldn't even attempt this. I'd fish somewhere else. Alright, that's it for this video. Thank you all for watching. I'll list all the gear in the video description. And I'll catch you on the next one. See ya!